What were the 10 dopest books that I read in 2024? I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I don't want to talk about a specific book that I read, but rather I want to do the usual end of the year sort of analysis or end of the year exploration that I do, where I talk about the 10 dopest books that I read in 2024. That's how I phrase it, and I really like that title, and I guess you could say that branding, although it's more just to do with how cool or how interesting the title seems to sound. I'm also going to do the usual TBR for 2025, so that'll be another video entirely, but that is on the agenda as we near the end of December. And so in 2024, I read quite a few good books, as well as some bad and some, middle of the road type books. And I came up with quite a list of books that wowed me and really stood out. And some were like no-brainers. Obviously, this is going to end up on the end of the year list. And others, I had to really think about it and kind of compare it with other books. It's hard to do that because you can't really compare, like, say, John Williams' Stoner with Lolita, because they're two different books, and saying one is better than the other is not necessarily that great because they're both good for different reasons. So you can't really rank them. And this isn't really going to be a ranking. This is just going to be 10 books that if you were to, if you were to watch this video alone, these would be the books that I would urge you to go out and read, as I think you'll have a pretty good time, or at least you'll be changed for the better from having read them. Now, with that said, there are some honorable mentions that I do have for this list, books that couldn't quite make the cut but were really good that you might want to check out anyways. That'd be Cormac McCarthy's The Road. Pretty good, but I felt like it didn't reach the heights that, say, No Country for Old Men or Blood Meridian did, and it is pretty hard for any book to really reach the heights that Blood Meridian did in terms of quality. Winter of Our Discontent by John Steinbeck, another book that I felt failed to live up to the standard that the author had previously set. Flamer, which was a graphic novel, pretty good. Also, I went to a school board meeting earlier in the year where someone was trying to ban that very book. It's about a sort of gay awakening. Live from Cairo, which I thought was pretty solid. Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, which was also really good. And 1,000 Crimes of Ming Su, which is one of the first books that I read of the year. And that probably would have made the list in any other year, but there were other more quality books, I would say. But it's still a very fascinating book, and it is a big tragic book, but the main revelation that happens at the end of the story is worth the price of admission, I would say. So definitely worth seeking out. And then there are a number of dishonorable mentions, only two really. One is The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller. Not a very good book. I think it portrays Batman nakedly, showing him as like a rich millionaire who is using Gotham as his own personal playground to settle grudges or whatnot. And I don't particularly like that. It portrays Batman nakedly because that is what he is, but he could be so much better than that. He's not supposed to be just that rich billionaire. He's supposed to be more. And Frank Miller does get at the heart of Batman, but it's a very ugly, very fascist take on Batman. So I do not like that, and I don't recommend it to anybody. Then there is Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which is atrocious, garbage, bad writing. The underlying conceit of the book that people with money are great, and that anybody who asks you to help them is trying to take from you, and that rich people might as well withdraw from society, become individualist, because collectivism is a punishment enforced upon you by the masses, which, no, that's bad, that's awful. John Galt's entire philosophy in this book is trash, and the end goal of the capitalist in the book is also trash. If society were as individualist as Ayn Rand wants it to be, it couldn't thrive. Nobody would thrive. Everything would collapse. And Ayn Rand thinks that's great, but Ayn Rand is also a dumbass. So don't even think about reading that book. I read it because I wanted something challenging, but also I felt like I had to read at least one Ayn Rand book, and I do not intend to read any more. This is garbage, and I think it's a standard of garbage going forward. I'll always say, well, this was bad, but at least it wasn't as bad as Atlas Shrugged. That is a dishonorable mention from me. Never seek it out, but mainly, find it and draw graffiti on the books, because it's not really art, and you could probably create better art from it. And so now we finally get into 6 minutes into this video, the actual list of books that I think are the best. So there's 10 here. I always try to cull it to 10, because any more it feels like I'm not really being true to sort of zeroing in on the actual quality book. So here are the 10. The first one is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. I said in the video that I felt it was incredibly academic, probably in a way where most people wouldn't just go out and read it, that mainly people study it in academia as sort of an understanding of how maybe Russian literature got to its point, or how modern literature reached its point, and like the true potential of Russian literature and just literature in general. I do like its sort of dual narrative of people from the upper class and how they get involved in this Russian-French war with Napoleon, and how it kind of destroys Russia. And then meanwhile, Tolstoy kind of takes a break to sort of analyze Napoleon as a leader and talk about history and how people proclaim Napoleon to be great. But if you look at the facts, it's like there were a lot of errors on Russia's part that allowed it to get to that point. And, in general, Napoleon made a lot of errors himself. So, it wasn't fated for Napoleon to lose in this Russian war, but it also wasn't fated for Russia to win. Really going to town on this sort of analysis, and combining that with the story and the sort of wanting to find meaning and ultimately finding nothing but suffering is pretty harsh. But I think Tolstoy weaves these narratives. I would say the story is really hard to get into, but when you do get into it, you see some beautiful writing on Tolstoy's part. So I do think War and Peace is worth checking out, and it belongs on this list here. Once again, my number 2 pick here is the Berserk series, specifically Volume 13. I didn't want to pick a specific volume, but Volume 13 really stands out. And this is by Kentaro Miura. Pretty solid writing, pretty solid art, but the ultimate story being that Griffith, in his desire to seek ambition, and realizing it all collapsing before him, chooses to blame Guts and makes a deal with these shadowy demon creatures, and in the process sells out the Band of the Hawk. And people die, and Guts feels betrayed and hurt, loses the woman he loves because she no longer really remembers him, and he actively seeks revenge against Griffith now. But the process of how Griffith arrives at that point, and the love that Guts feels for the Band of the Hawk and Casca, and even Griffith, before realizing that he kind of has to make a name for himself. I think it's brilliant writing. I think it's one of the best stories told in fiction, specifically the Golden Age arc. But Volume 13 and how it all sort of culminates is some of the best writing that I've ever seen in literature. Kentaro Miura does a great job of showing through the art as well as through the story Guts' struggle and wanting to connect with others, but also being hurt and kind of distancing himself and realizing that if he gets attached, that could be used against him in some sort of way. I think Kentaro Miura is really good at sort of highlighting emotion in these stories, and especially portraying that on Guts' face. So volume 13, definitely worth seeking out, but you would have to read volumes 1 through 12 to really get to that point. But I think the entire Berserk series is definitely worth checking out, and I'm probably not the first person to say that. There's a reason why it's so beloved by people who read not only, manga, but also other forms of media as well. So I also have for number 3, A Hero Born by Jin Yong. I do think it's some really good Chinese literature. I love the story of like martial arts warriors, like their children being separated but fated to come together, and the process of training them and becoming greater warriors, and sort of realizing their own flaws in the process, and so working to overcome those flaws in a number of ways. This is definitely an introduction. It doesn't really feel like a complete story at times, but the characterization and the sort of elaborate fight scenes that Jin Yong is depicting in a way that really immerse you in the story, because a lot of times it's really hard to write fight scenes and stories, but Jin Yong manages to do it in a way that immerses you and it makes you want to continue reading. I think it's a very compelling story. I didn't enjoy the A Bond Undone, the sequel, as much, which is really just the same story, and I feel like a big problem is that it rather than being one story, they separated it out into like 4 different parts. So it's fine. It's just like the separation makes it hard to really get into, because you're not getting the complete story. Whereas if you read it in the original Chinese, maybe you might get an aspect of that. But I do think A Hero Born is a great place to start, especially if you want some quality Chinese literature. The 4th book on my list is a Bevan recommendation from that period of time where we were still doing a book club before she moved to India. And that book is Butts, A Backstory by Heather Radke. A pretty solid exploration of how we perceive the human butt, which is a very strange sort of story to talk about. But talking about the racism related to it, the cultural appropriation, and how we place a lot of standards on people of color that we don't place on white individuals or anything like that. Really, it wasn't a place where I'd expect to see some social injustice taking place, but that's what I found with the book, and Radke really presents a very complete and sort of complex narrative exploring the entire history of the butt, and where we're at now, and what we can do to sort of equalize that narrative on who was beautiful, and especially when we talk about the butt, which is, it feels like it's unimportant, but also when you read the book, it feels very important. So I really developed a small connection with the book, and I think that's why I placed it on the list here. So definitely go seek this one out. The 5th book on the list is Yolk by Mary H.K. Choi. Definitely one that I wasn't expecting to hit me as hard as it did, but it was a very solid book. It's basically a woman with an eating disorder, is stuck in a relationship that she doesn't like, comes back into contact with her sister who's dealing with cancer, and they sort of explore their relationship and their past with their troubled history with their mother, all while trying to hide her eating disorder and all the other sort of negative things that she might do in her life. And it's a very powerful, very touching story, and you really root for the main character of the story. I was like, I hope she makes it through this in a pretty strong and substantial manner. And spoiler alert, she does, but she goes through that hero's journey in a very small kind of way, but in a still significant way. And the ending definitely feels earned in that struggle, and also noting how, the story doesn't really end there. The story really has to continue long after that, and we have to work at making ourselves better. So Yolk is definitely a very compelling story. I should really check out Mary Choi. Again, seeing if she has come out with anything, and I think I might do that in 2025, because there's probably more compelling books that she's written that are worth exploring. The sixth book on my list is The Water That Falls on You from Nowhere by John Chu. This was actually not a book, but it was a short story. Basically, a gay man in a gay relationship is going to see his family and bringing his lover along. But the twist is that a new phenomenon is happening where if you lie, it rains on you. So people try not to lie at all, or they twist sort of the language to make it so they're not really lying. And there's that tension where if you reveal that you like are in this gay relationship, your parents might not be happy with you, but also if you lie at all, they'll realize that you're lying because it'll rain on you. And then like the troubled relationship within the family, and the ending definitely feels pretty strong too. So definitely a solid short story that presents a very interesting sort of science fiction twist that definitely worth reading. The seventh book on my list is actually Butcher's Crossing by John Williams, which I believe was also on a previous year's list. John Williams, I mean, because if you're familiar with this channel, you know that I love Stoner by John Williams. One of the best books ever written, in my opinion. And I read another one of his books called Augustus, which was fine, but it wasn't as compelling as Stoner. But Butcher's Crossing feels somewhat equal to Stoner. Still not like the same quality or same level of emotion that I felt when I read Stoner. But Butcher's Crossing is still a very powerful book. The entire idea is that, people say you go to nature, it'll help you, it'll make you feel better, and you'll really learn more about yourself. And the main character of the story does that, but they find out, no, nature will try to kill you, and sometimes there is no reward for your struggles out there in nature. So definitely sort of developing a sense of nihilism, or a sense that the meaning that you placed on this thing, this hostile thing, when you realize what it truly is like, you're gonna be devastated. And it's sort of like a coming of age story as well, where like the main character becomes an adult in their own way, and they eventually head back to the urban city because it's not as hostile comparatively. Definitely a very solid book. I ended up watching the movie and it felt pretty good, but it didn't capture the same emotion and same sort of hostility that the book did. So I definitely recommend checking it out, and then also reading Stoner, because that is high quality too. Another book on my list is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I wanted to read this because I felt like it was on the same level of War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Books that I've always felt were compared in some way, or sort of like presented like, here are the great Russian authors. And so I checked it out. I found it to be very compelling. There were a lot of problems with the book where I felt like it was in a rush to redeem somebody who had murdered, rather than sort of work towards that ending. But I do think the redemption feels sort of earned in some way, and the guilt, the individual guilt that one person feels, makes the story better too, because you can really see how the main character, whose name I'm forgetting, suffers greatly because of what he did and how he wants to be found out, but he also doesn't want to be found out. And I think Dostoevsky also does a great job of exploring how the environment kind of leads you to these decisions. Like, the main character didn't just decide to wake up one day and say, hey, I'm going to kill somebody. He was from a lower class background. He was suffering at a time when the wealthy in Russia were kind of exploiting the poorer population. They had very little, they had nothing, practically nothing at all. And so the main character is like, well, I'm going to go hurt the person who I feel is responsible, and we'll see what happens from there. But that doesn't really make them feel better, and it doesn't really solve their problem, partially because they didn't aim high enough, but also because murdering people doesn't exactly solve all your problems. That's sort of fascinating, but it's like you can see how Dostoevsky, even though he doesn't necessarily agree that the monarchy is the problem, he still points fingers at the wealthy ruling class of Russia and says, this is kind of what is going to happen if you if you force people into poverty, if you force people to suffer like this. And then the ending of the book is very interesting, and how the main character comes across his redemption with the help of the woman that he's with. I do think that Dostoevsky's decision to make it focused on God, how he seeks redemption by aligning himself and trying to become better through religion, through finding God, through seeking redemption and whatnot in that way. I feel like that's not how it necessarily should go. Like, you can find redemption in other ways. You can come to a sense of morality and purpose without leaning on God. But God does help. That is how some people find their redemption, how some people get out of this sort of negative mindset and find themselves in a way where they're willing to forgive themselves and be forgiven by others, be forgiven by a higher power. But to solely rely on God as a sort of explanation and sort of God as the avenue for that ignores how you can really find that forgiveness in other ways. But all that's to say, like, as I was reading, I had that emotional connection. I had all of those thoughts about this very specific book, and that's probably why it's on this list, because even though I felt like it wasn't as good as it could have been in some areas, I still had a very big sort of interaction with this book that definitely tells me that it must have been good, that I'm probably going to be thinking about it for a while if it's left such a lasting impression on me. The other book that's on the list, number 9, is The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. I do think it was kind of bare bones as compared to some of the other books that I read, but the story of the book, specifically of Sherman Alexie trying to point out some of the issues that exist on the reservation, and how just because you move into like a better school, that doesn't necessarily erase that aspect of your identity, and it's not going to make people see you in a more positive light, especially if you have that negative self-doubt that's going to sort of tear you apart, and you're not going to move beyond that unless you have the mindset that you want to move beyond that. And all of that going on in the mind of a teenager, there's a lot of anguish there and a lot of self-hate that maybe you can't see for your own community. And the ending of the story that takes place at a basketball game that's highly competitive, and the ultimate realization that, yeah, you won, but you won against people who had nothing, and you're kind of the bad guys in this story. It's really sad, but it's also a very compelling book, and Sherman Alexie's writing is a lot of fun at the same time. Somewhat semi-autobiographical, but worth a lot of, it's worth a lot, or I think it gives you a lot to think about as well. Definitely stuff that's still swimming around my mind even after I read it months later. Now, number 10, the last book on my list, is Bad Marie by Marcy Dermansky. I was actually debating whether to put this book on the list because it is good, but it does have a few problems. But I think because of how much it stuck with me and how much I'm going to continue to think about it going forward, I think it's more than earned its place on this list. Just the sort of themes that Dermansky's kind of exploring, people who feel lost and who don't really have a lot in life, kind of like with Crime and Punishment, just sort of latching on to those who do have a lot and kind of wishing they were in their position. How Marie in this story absconds with her friend's husband and even takes her child because these people kind of give her a sense of purpose initially, only to realize that in absconding with that and taking the child, that they are in way over their head. They have no idea what they can do, that they were merely observing the situation temporarily, and now that they have a full understanding of all aspects, they're not prepared for any of this, and keeping on going and trying to recapture any sense of meaning that Marie once had, only to realize that she, again, misunderstood everything, read these situations wrong, and there is no real meaning for her. And she's the only way she's going to really find that is by working towards it for herself, is by trying to become a better person. And she also, like, the ending of the story as well, where she tries to kill herself and realizes, oh wait, I don't want to die. I can't die. I need to continue moving, even though it feels like I have nothing to live for. That's really strong. And then, like, also how she kind of just turns herself in, because it's an acceptance of how she put herself in that situation, and like, the only reasonable thing to do is to finally accept accountability, is to finally make something happen that benefits the child in this situation. It's very unfortunate for Marie how the story turns out for her, but you do have hope that maybe things might get better because she's finally accepting a little accountability. But her decision to go back to prison, if that's what's really going to happen, might just be like a deeper sort of obfuscation of the truth, or a deeper way for her to avoid reality. By going back to jail, she doesn't have to focus on the real world and how she's not capable of handling it. A lot worth thinking about there. And there's a lot of problems with the story, but I think Dermansky's writing and the sort of psychological nature of the story, how you're inside Marie's head, it makes it a very compelling read. So I think that's why it's ended up on the list, because, the emotional connection that I got to the book, but also the sort of exploration of Marie and how she feels like a very complete, very complicated character. Anyway, that was my list of 10 dope reads that I read in 2024. Very solid books, very compelling books. I had an emotional connection with pretty much all of them, whether it be joy, sadness, sort of like a desire to read more, anger, frustration, a lot of things like that. And I think that's what books should be. Like, when you're reading, you should develop that kind of connection with them. And if that connection isn't there, that's obviously a sign that author either didn't do their job, or maybe this wasn't just a book for you. Sometimes a book isn't necessarily bad, it's just not connecting with you in the way that you had hoped it would. So I definitely recommend that you seek out all 10 of those books if you want something intriguing or exciting in 2025. If you have any recommendations based on what you saw here, let me know in the comments below. Let's have a discussion about these books. It's possible that you might have liked one of the dishonorable mentions, or you might have hated one of the ones that I recommended, but I always am willing to hear your take on this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this list or this channel if they don't already know. And also join the Discord. There's a link to it in the description. Let me know in there, like, what your favorite books are. Let's talk about books, movies, other things like that. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and book reading travels. Farewell.